So good morning. Good to see y'all this morning on this October 27th. What is it, 90 degrees outside already? Holy cow, when's the cool weather coming? Anyway, it's good to see y'all. It's always good to come and gather together and kind of come out of the craziness of this world and gather together around God's Word and find out what it is that God might say to us this morning. And we've been going through Hebrews, I don't know, forever, for a pretty long time. And I can only say it this way because, well, it's the truth for me, is that some of this stuff's really weird, Aaron. I mean, I don't understand. Sometimes I read the readings and I think, what does that have to do with us in 2020, 24? And he's talking to these Hebrew people. It's a totally different culture, a totally different time. What does this really have to do with us? And my hope this morning is that we can find some relevancy in the text. And it's two pretty long texts, so I'm going to have to break it into two. And, so let's just kind of jump right in. Hebrews chapter 9, verse 15. We're going to read this one and pause for a minute. For this reason, he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that, since a death has taken place for the redemption of the transgressions that were committed under the first covenant, those who have been called may receive the promise of the eternal inheritance. For where a covenant is, there must of necessity be a death of the one who made it. I just want to pause real quick right here and talk just a minute about covenant, because that's kind of a weird word for us. We know about contracts, right? If you have a mortgage or a car payment or a credit card or maybe a work contract, anyway, we know what contracts are, right? Those are the terms and conditions of the agreement. It's pretty black and white. It's kind of a letter of the law thing. If you don't pay your mortgage on the 15th, as it says per the contract, what happens? We know about contracts. This covenant thing is different. And the reason covenant is different is because it's about relationship, okay? And Aaron's been giving us a wonderful illustration of a covenant of, he and I have a covenant. And the covenant is that if something happens to him, I take care of his family. Something happens to me, he takes care of my family. And then we sacrifice this ox in the middle, and if either one of us breaks the covenant, it may happen to us what happened to the ox. Okay? That's an illustration of really the way that culture would think about it. But I want you to think a little bit deeper, and heaven forbid, but something happens to Aaron. And we've made that covenant. So now, Sarah and the Lido kids are part of my family. They get access to everything that my son has access to. One of the kids needs braces, I'm responsible. We help Breezy continue to go to college. They become part of us and our family. And whatever happens for them, we're involved. You can imagine my son might think that a bit weird because, raise your hand if you think all of the practices of the Lido family are exactly the same as mine. They're not, right? I mean, they do things differently in their home. And the covenant is not conditioned upon Sarah and their children behaving the way that I want them to, or in accordance with my family. And here's the really hard one, because see where it says eternal inheritance? Imagine my parents someday will die, and I have an inheritance. Imagine Sarah has just as much access and gets an equal share of my parents' inheritance. Might be kind of weird, right? And the kids do as well. Whatever my parents have, for 86 years of their life, accumulated, home, whatever it is, they have access to that. They're going to get half of it. Would be kind of hard, right? They weren't there for all these years. But they get it. They get access to the inheritance. It's really kind of strange stuff. So this covenant thing is about relationship more than a contract. I found something really interesting talking about covenant. Becoming part of the covenant family is the highest level of responsibility where people desire to take responsibility for living a Christ-centered life and living out the mission and vision of Oikos Church. Becoming part of the covenant family, you are saying that you desire to follow Jesus and be held accountable for living in the way of Jesus and are committed to living in a rhythm of life in both the gathered and scattered expressions of church. Those in the covenant family are able to become elders, board members, and are able to vote on big decisions that they may be made by the congregation. In order to be part of the covenant family, you will need to enter into covenant relationship with the rest of those who have been signed by signing the Oikos Church covenant. So you get that's on the website. You can go look at that if you want to. It's talking about covenant. You notice that Aaron doesn't like, okay, this is Sunday where we're going to review the covenant and how well that you've complied with it. We don't ever have that because the covenant is about relationship. But you remember what I just said, that suddenly, by some amazing thing called God's covenant, the Lytle family has access to my family and all that that means. So, in relevance to us, in relevance to inheritance and what have you, you kind of get the sense of what we're talking about in this covenant thing, right? There was another thought I had about covenant, if I can remember it. Behaviors are not the deal. It's about the relationship. And we here are a covenant family and what that may look like. Oh, I remember what I was thinking about. So I'm very thankful for Aaron and my family because there have been times when my mom or my son get it between a rock and a hard place and they might call Aaron. And guess what? He always answers the phone. And these are maybe even family problems, right? And the thought that I have, and this is maybe a little bit of a tough question for you, but I want you to think about it. Do we reciprocate that to him? Because it's about the relationship, not about a rule. Just a thought. So let's keep reading and see what else we have here. For a covenant is valid only when men are dead. Remember the one I talked about with Aaron and I, and one of us dies? For it is never enforced while the one who made it lives. Therefore, even the first covenant was not inaugurated without blood. Okay, I'm going to pause for real quick. So when we're talking about covenant, in the context of what I said just now about it being a relationship kind of deal, for these Jewish people, they had a long history of covenant. See, they remembered the Old Testament, and they remembered Adam and Eve, naked. What did God do? Killed an animal and gave them clothes. A covenant. They knew the covenant of Noah. Y'all know about the rainbow, right? They knew that really well. So when we're talking about a covenant word, they really knew what covenant meant, but they also understood the covenant of Abraham. You remember the covenant of Abraham, circumcision? Remember the other covenant with Abraham when God comes to him and says, if you can count the stars in the sky, that's how many children you're going to have? Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. That's another covenant. This covenant we're talking about here is Moses. It's the Mosaic covenant. And you remember when I was a kid during Easter, there was always the famous Charlton Heston movie about the Jews and the whole thing, and they showed the Ten Commandments and what have you. So, but we're talking about that covenant, and we could look at it for our sakes, just the Ten Commandments, the moral law. There was other parts of it too, civil and ceremonial law, but we're just talking about the moral law and talking about that. And if we were to discuss at each table right now about the moral law, the Ten Commandments, we'd all say, oh yeah, that's good stuff. That's really good. Okay? Those are positive things. If we live in accordance with those Ten Commandments, life would be really, really good. Let's go to the next text. One more forward. For when every commandment had been spoken by Moses to all the people according to the law, he took the blood of the calves and the goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop, and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, this is the blood of the covenant which God commanded you. And in the same way he sprinkled both the tabernacle and all the vessels of the ministry with the blood. And according to the law, one may almost say, all things are cleansed with blood. And without shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. Therefore, it was necessary for the copies of the things in the heavens to be cleansed with these, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ did not enter a holy place made with hands, a mere copy of the true one, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. Nor was it that he would offer himself often, as a high priest enters the holy place year by year with blood that is not his own. Otherwise, he would have needed to suffer often since the foundation of the world. But now, once at the consummation of the ages, he has been manifested to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And inasmuch as it is appointed for men to die once, and after this judgment comes, so Christ also, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time for salvation without reference to sin to those who eagerly await him. This is the kind of text I'm talking about. It's like, what the heck? What does this have to do with us? Talking about sacrifice. We don't sacrifice. But for these people, these Hebrew people, they understood, because up until this time, they would actually sacrifice. If you wanted to come before God, there had to be a spilling of blood. I mean, maybe my family could afford an ox, and so we'd sacrifice an ox, and another family would be able to afford a pigeon, so they'd sacrifice a pigeon. But there had to be something for us to be able to come before God. Because these wonderful 10 Commandments that we would all agree are good things, good ideas for life, tells us what to do and what not to do, great ideas on life, and we can live that way, it'd be perfect. But there's one problem. And Aaron talked about it during the confession. We don't. We don't hear, and we certainly don't outwardly. Talking about this covenant stuff reminds me, part of y'all maybe don't know, but I'm an only child, and my son is an only child. So you can imagine how weird it would be if suddenly we take on the Lytle family, and my son's going like, I don't know about that, you know. They're kind of horning in on time with my grandmother and things like that, right? It would be difficult. But part of the problem is because we're selfish people. And even in this idea of a covenant, suddenly we'd say, well, we don't like the way the Lytle kids act. You know, they're different than us. And we would start judging them, and then it creates division, and pretty soon we're fighting, and then you got the Hatfields and the McCoys going on, I guess. But the point of this is that we have this wonderful moral law, and that none of us will comply, and therefore a sacrifice has to be made to make up for it. And much of what would happen between my family and our new family members would be like this. Man, can you believe that Sarah and the kid, we wouldn't do it directly to them, right? That'd be not nice. But we talk about them behind their back, even though they're part of our family. And I think y'all probably have experienced that even in your own families, right? Where brother and brother, sister and sister kind of team up on each other. So this covenant sacrifice thing is something that makes sense for these Jewish people, and I hope it's starting to make a little bit of sense for you, in that because our inability to comply with these moral law that we would all agree are good things, there has to be a sacrifice. Now, we could have a discussion of why, but all I can tell you is that's the way that God has decided it to be. And that's just the way it is. There has to be a sacrifice. And so we're going to talk now about the sacrifice more, and what I want you to think about while we're reading this is, so these Jewish people who knew this Old Testament and knew about covenants and knew about sacrifice and understood all this stuff, why is Jesus so hard to believe in? Now, what you have to appreciate is that even today, Jewish people believe in a Messiah. For them, the Messiah is kind of what we think of as the second coming. They don't acknowledge that Jesus, when he came and lived on earth, is the Messiah. But they still believe a Messiah is coming. And it would be something like what you and I believe in terms of the second coming. Boy, when he comes back, he's going to make everything right. And order will be put back in place, and everything that's wrong will be made right. They believe that. But why is it, knowing all that they have such a hard time believing in the Messiah that came? Okay, chapter 10. For the law, since it has only a shadow of the good things to come and not the very form of things, can never, by the same sacrifices which they offer continually year by year, make perfect those who draw near. Otherwise, would they not have ceased to be offered? Because the worshipers, having once been cleansed, would no longer have had consciousness of sins. But in those sacrifices there is a reminder of sins year by year. For it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. Therefore, when he comes into the world, he says, sacrifice and offering you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me. In whole burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin you have taken no pleasure. Then I said, behold, I have come. In the scroll of the book it is written of me, to do your will, O God. So what it's saying here is that to these Jewish people is, these regular sacrifices that we do to come before God, and once a year we have a really big time one. Those reoccurring things that we've been doing all the way back to Moses of sacrificing his, you realize that those are of no value. And God even says it in his word. I think, Casey, I think I put a couple of texts in there, maybe Hebrews 51. I'm sorry, Psalm 51. Do you see that one? Maybe I didn't. So let me just read it to you. Oh, there it is. O Lord, open my lips that my mouth may declare your praise. For you did not delight in sacrifice, otherwise I'd give it. You are not pleased with burnt offering. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and a contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. This is King David, Psalm 51, after the famous Bathsheba mess. And what is he saying about sacrifice? It's just never enough. It's not good enough. I think there's one more text like that I included. What are your multiplied sacrifices to me, says the Lord? I've had enough of burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fed cattle, and I take no pleasure in the bloods of bulls, lambs, or goats. That's Isaiah 1:11. So I'm really reconfirming and really want to nail home the point that there's no sacrifice good enough. There's only one. And it's something that, for me, is really important for us, because we say, well, we don't sacrifice animals here, Dave. But sometimes we begin to think that there is something we can do that's good enough. Now, I'm speaking honestly about myself. I kind of get comfortable in my thinking of how this thing between God and I works. Now, reciprocally, there are other times when I think I'll never be able to do enough. I've done so bad, this is so awful, I can never make up for this. And I can be hung up in either one of those places. But the important thing here is to recognize, what is God saying in his word? There's no sacrifice good enough. There's only one who can satisfy God. And if I can begin to appropriate that it's the one sacrifice that was made for me by his son, then I can begin to be relieved from these two sides. The one of me thinking I'm good enough and the other one thinking I'll never be good enough. Because both of those are lies. And what's really interesting, and we're going to start to get to the heart of the matter of the question that I asked you a moment ago, why is it so hard for the Jewish people to believe in a Messiah? The Matthew text, I think it is Matthew 5. This is Jesus speaking, but if you had known what this means, I desire compassion and not a sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. Can you see in this context of covenant and relationship what it looks like for Jesus? Compassion, not sacrifice. Not me doing something to make myself good enough or thinking that I'm so far away because I've done so wrong, but rather compassion. Can you see how that's a relational thing, not a letter of the law thing? Okay? Let's finish off the Hebrews text. And after saying above sacrifices and offerings and whole burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin, you have not desired, nor have you taken pleasure in them, which are offered according to the law. Then he said, behold, I have come to do your will. He takes away the first in order to establish the second. By this we will have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once and for all. So what happens is, in this discussion, or this letter, he's talking about covenant, which they all understood, and then he starts talking about sacrifice, which they all have a sense of, and I'm trying to make this relevant to us. And in this sacrifice thing, what he's pointing to is that the one sacrifice has been made, the Messiah. And again, Jewish people today don't have a hard time believing that there is a Messiah. They just don't believe Jesus is the one. And the question I ask you is, why would people who have so much relevant information and so much understanding of God's covenants have a hard time believing in the Messiah? And maybe another way of saying it is, if Jesus is the Messiah, what is the implications for us? And so, just briefly, at your tables, I want you to talk about what are the implications of the Messiah. Okay? If Jesus is the Messiah, what are the implications to us? Okay? So if y'all can discuss that real quick just for a moment. What are the implications of the Messiah upon us, upon you? Okay, gave y'all a couple of minutes to kind of talk that through at your tables. I hope y'all came with some stuff. So now I want to ask you, if anybody's willing to share, again, in the context of why was this so hard for them to believe, my question for you, what are the implications? So what are the implications? If Jesus is the Messiah, and he did come and he lived the perfect life we could never live, he took our place on the cross and he died on the cross and he rose from the dead 3 days later, what are the implications for us? Anyone? Yes, sir. Say, what was the second part there? We don't have to do anything for salvation, and?
If I don't have to do anything, Jesus paid it all.
Don't have to do anything, Jesus paid it all.
Now, I don't have to be good. I don't have to love my neighbor. I don't have to do that. But the difference is, I get to. It's my joy to do that because of what Jesus did.
So in response to what Jesus did for me, it's not a have-to thing, it's a get-to thing. And the Apostle Paul famously said, all things are permissible, but not all things are profitable. I can do anything everybody else does, but some of them just really not healthy.
And I'm not going to do some of those things because I love Jesus.
Okay, I'm not going to do some of those things because I love Jesus. What are the other implications of the Messiah being real? Anyone? Aaron Pastor?
Well, Zach said,
Out of the mouth of babes.
the traits of Jesus become ours.
Okay, thanks be to the life and death and resurrection of Jesus, his traits become ours. Okay? That great stuff, absolutely true. What else are the implications? Yes, ma'am. So if he is the Messiah, then he is the truth and the only truth, and things that I used to believe in, and maybe even some today, errantly, are not accurate. Awesome stuff. What else? Jesus is the Messiah. What are the implications to us? It implies that we needed saving in the first place. Anyone disagree with that? See, so far, okay, Awesome. Great stuff. Yes, we absolutely need saving. That's why we confess when we come here. What were you going to say, Rosalinda? So, see, Jesus is because he's alive and he's real, he's our advocate before the Father. And if you know what a courtroom looks like and you've ever been to one, you know that you have a legal representation and you have an accuser, and maybe you're on the defendant, and there's a judge, and only your representation can talk to the judge. You cannot speak to the judge directly. Absolutely. Any other implications about the Messiah in our lives today? So you remember this was in the context. So why would these Jewish people who knew so much about the coming and the prophecies and all this stuff and sacrifices, they're still waiting for the Messiah, why did they miss the boat? And it wasn't any of the reasons we just discussed. The deal is, yeah, does that make sense? We've been practicing this. I learned it from my parents. I did it with my grandparents and my great-grandparents, and all the way back to Moses. We've been living like this. This is the covenant. This is the relationship that we have. And this Jesus guy comes along and says, well, yeah, that doesn't count anymore. It's a new covenant. And by the way, what is it that you often say when you're consecrating the elements before communion? You talk about a new covenant. It's a new covenant. And if, even for us, if I said, you know the way we've been doing things, we're going to do them a totally new way, and we're going to change everything, I know that you would all raise your hand and say, yes, change. I can't wait. Let's all change. Right? No. We struggle with change. Now, I'm okay with you guys changing, but if you ask me to change, that's a problem. And so you understand what's going on with these Jewish people who are hearing about a Messiah. We've been doing this for years, personally, all the way back to Moses, and we can trace our genealogy all the way back to Abraham, and you're saying none of that matters anymore because it's not about what I do anymore. Oh, and by the way, you talk about change. No longer an eye and eye and a tooth for the tooth. Now it's about love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And I found one that's really relevant to us to give you an idea how hard this changed way of Jesus is. I'm going to read this to you. Okay, so in the context of today, of where we are at culturally, I want you to think about this, okay? Because this is the new way. Every person is to be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Okay, so we can vote. Some of you will, some of you may not. Some of us already have, but some of us will. And the deal is, when the person that you wanted to win the election doesn't win, subject yourself to that person. And you say, whoa, whoa, whoa. This means if that person I don't want wins, this could mean the end of this country and democracy and all of it as I know it. And my parents and my great-grandparents and on, we've been practicing this all a while. Now you want me to go with this other form of a person I don't even agree with? What did Jesus, well, not Jesus, but God's Word just say? You understand how hard this is? When we start talking about the change, we start talking about love your enemies. I mean, I'm quite sure somebody in here has somebody in their lives somewhere along the way that was really, really mean. I mean, in a really bad way. And guess what Jesus says? Yeah, I love that person. You get an idea why this is so hard for those Hebrew people? Because guess what? We don't like change. We certainly don't like change, which is so vastly different than what we've believed until now. And when it talks about making myself submissive, you got to be kidding me. And this Jesus guy says, I desire compassion and not sacrifice. You want me to have compassion for these people who make bad choices all the time? And they're just homeless people and people who are addicted to drugs. And you want me to have compassion for them? And Jesus' answer is yes. What about all the people who don't come to church? I'm here all the time. I'm trying to live the best life I can. And Jesus says, yeah, those are other people. I really want you to have compassion on them. So I hope you're getting a sense of how difficult it was for those Jewish people believing in a complete sacrifice where there's nothing else required of us, but there is a new way because, as Zach said, we take on the characteristics of Jesus now. There's a new way. But if we're honest, it's pretty dang hard. I wanted to give you a last example of kind of this whole thing with the covenant. As I said, I'm an only child. Back in 2016, I sold my home in Magnolia, and moved into town, and kind of never moved out of my parents' house. I stay there. I'm part of this fourth commandment issue, but also I stay with them that trying to be a good son. And by the way, someday when they die, guess who the inheritance goes to? So there's some motivation in there, right? To be honest. Raise your hand if you think I always honor my parents. I'm 62 years old. I should have it by now, right? That we never have a conflict in the house between just the three of us. It's mostly them, but you get the point. Now what happens is that sometimes I'm obedient to that fourth commandment and the relational component. It just happens. Because Jesus is living in me that day and, everything works out fine. Other times, didn't sleep well or whatever, got a stomach ache or whatever, and I really don't want to, but I do it anyway. And then other times in the relationship, sometimes I just have had my fill, and I say, think, do, whatever, that is not honoring my parents. My parents could say, you know what? We see your motivation and we realize that you're only doing this because you're supposed to. So guess what? You're out. Or my parents could say, you remember the time when you said that, did this, or whatever? They could say, we're done with you. And I could say, well, let me make up for it. And they could say, well, there's no way of making up for it. You've gone too far. And I'd say, well, yeah, but what about all the times that I was a good son? And they would say, yeah, but that time that you went too far is the one that counts. And then, guess what happens to my son? Because I'm out, he's out. And then he's upset with me. And on goes this thing of not honoring the authority in my life. That's what Romans 13 is about the government officials. It's natural for us to rebel. Okay, if you really make me, whoever the president is, I'll respect that. If you really, but I don't really want to. I guess that's better than not doing it all, or starting a civil war. But come on, I mean, what kind of relationship is that where I'm only doing it because I have to? But yet Jesus doesn't give us an excuse. He doesn't say, I get it. That's a terrible leader. He doesn't say, yeah, I get it with your parents. They are difficult. The expectation is always the same, that I would do like Zach said, like him, who always honored his parents. Hopefully that's given you some context of this reading and how that might apply to us. But the real problem of the Messiah is that if he is the Messiah, that means he paid the price. And if he paid the price, that means he bought us. And if he bought us, guess what? He owns us. And if he owns us, he can do whatever he pleases. That's a hard one. So if he allows bad things to occur in our lives, or he promotes good things in our lives, that's his choice. And guess what? I mean, I don't understand why Lytles had to go through the whole Mario experience. I mean, Aaron's on his team. So why not cut him a break? Right? But for whatever reason, and for, by the way, good reasons, somehow God allowed that. If I told you, because I think everybody in here, if I told everybody in here, everybody has a boss, right? If I told you, what you want is some more bosses, right? More bosses in your life. Like, no, one's enough. Well, if I go with this contract idea and letter of the law kind of deal, I'm asking for a lot of bosses. On the other hand, there's the Jesus boss who said, no contract relationship. It's about our relationship together, and we'll work it out together, and we'll grow together, and we'll figure this stuff out. And I read the covenant agreement for us at Oikos, and I'm going to wrap it up by thinking about this. So we're coming together next month to vote on this facility and what to do. You know, do we do what needs to be done to bring the facility up to standards and fully utilize it? Do we sell it? Do we close down Oikos? You know, what do we do? What goes on here? And the question is, will we look at it from the relational component? Or are we going to look at it from letter of the law kind of stuff? And what I'll tell you is that the church that I grew up in was what you would call a program church. And when I went to church, we had Sunday school. They had activities during the week. The kids came together or whatever. Parents could go to marriage groups and what have you. They had all these there was Easter, big to do on Easter. There was a Christmas pageant. It was all these programs. And that was in my generation. And I don't know if you know, but right now about 50% of Americans would say, I'm a Christian. You can define that however you want. But there's 400 million people, 200 million people. They're nowhere near where I was. Some of them haven't even been to church ever, of 200 million people. And even of the 200 million say, yeah, I'm Christian, some of that's some sketchy stuff too. Things have changed huge. And I'm not talking about the Jesus kind of change that he's asking us individually. I'm talking about the world and how it works. This covenant that we have with each other is more about individual evangelism. Would that be an accurate statement? It's about each one of us is connected to people in our world, whether it's family or work or friends or what have you, and are we taking those characteristics of Jesus to them? And we would even say, Sunday's really important. You know, the Bible even tells us, let us not forsake assembling together as is the habit of some. Sunday's really important. Do you know what's really, really important? Those characteristics of Jesus Monday through Saturday. And because it's about relationships more than letter of the law. And what unfortunately we get hung up on is behaviors. Because you remember I gave you the example of the Lytles become part of my family and we're all caught up in their behaviors, not the relationship. And so we'll have that vote and that will work itself out. I'm sure it's driven by the Holy Spirit. But I just wanted you to think about it again in terms of the covenant, the relational component, and the not having to do, but having the gift, and what that looks like for us. And if we are going to be a covenant family, think about what that means in the example I gave of us and taking on each other when we're hurting. Or reciprocating, as I suggested, with our fearless leader. Well, I hope that's making some sense in terms of covenant and sacrifice and the Messiah and the completion of the Messiah. We have been bought and paid for, but now we have a boss. And the question is, how are we responding to that boss? Realizing that we never do it perfectly. Let's close in prayer.